Ahoy Captain, welcome to the FuelEU Pool Tool Excel tool tutorial. This video is dedicated to members and paid users, and feel free to skip ahead to the fun parts if you don't have time for any introductions. If you're interested in purchasing the Excel itself, or if you simply look to some inspiration and trying to make it on your own, feel free to hang on and see how we made and built the Excel for FuelEU pooling mechanisms. Before we start, however, a few disclaimers from our part, as always. This tool itself is an estimate. It is not the perfect representation of your situation. We make easy to use tools, ways for you to do your own analysis, but unfortunately we do not have your ship information available. So always check, do a sanity check, and if needed a number check in some cases to make sure that you get what you need ultimately. Secondly, it is not based on any ship type, so if you have a ship that's not subject to FuelEU, for example, it shouldn't be here or in this pool. We simply do not check on whether or not FuelEU applies at the moment. And lastly, it is subject to change. The FuelEU regulations are, well, or have been constantly changing in the last 1.5 years. There's still things to be done, and also with regards to this tool itself, we are constantly updating features based on your demands. But hey, nobody likes disclaimers, and also nobody likes all these things that are changing, etc. So we try to make life easier for you by providing you the opportunity to contact the help desk when you have any questions at all. We are there for you and would like to help you further on your sustainability journey and make sure that you get the help that you need. But without further ado, let's dive into the FuelEU Pool Tool Excel. And here we go. This is the Excel. This is the instruction page where you probably have found the tool tutorial as well. You can download the guide for more background information too. I'll show that at the end when we go to references. And here we see the structure of the Excel. So we see an input, we see output, calculations, penalty tables, fuel table, biofuels pathways, and references. Most of the work that you need to do if you make analysis will be in output and a bit in input. Calculations are done in, yes, calculations, to try to make it obvious and easy. The penalty tables show all the penalties for the 10 different ships until 2050. The fuel table shows the fuel parameters that we adhere to, especially fuel costs per metric ton, but also in case of biofuels and RFBOs, E values and water tank values are important. I'll show you that. We have some representative numbers for different biofuel pathways, and then finally the references where we get everything from. That's it. Let's go to input, and for each tab I'll let you know how we build the different formulas, how we've structured it so that you can work around it on your own and hopefully get better analysis and scenarios for your case. The input tab should speak for itself. It's where all the input happens. All the input also in the output table, weirdly enough, is highlighted in a gray background with white font. So we can change the GWP, the global warming potential values. These are coming from IPCC. Shouldn't have to be changed, but we saw different numbers at different places, probably all the ones. The reporting year that you're investigating in the output table, and also the EU ETS price for costs indication, of course. Here you can change ship name, so we're gonna, well, I like ship 1 to 10, but just to show you, we're gonna do McBoaty here as well. Fuel type, that's where you can choose between different fuel type. We have made a list here. If you're not familiar with lists, you can go to data and then data tools, data validation, and there you can change lists and maybe set it to any value if you just wanted to have it removed. This is where we input metric tons intra-EU. Now this is probably going to be a major change in the future, so if you're a member, you're lucky. If you're not a member, come back later, because we will probably input intra-EU, extra-EU, and also multiple fuel blends for both in sailing in the EU and sailing outside the EU. What basically happens is you can also put it together by taking 50% of the fuel consumption outside from to EU into the intra-EU this part, but the regulation states that from and to EU waters you have to account for 50% of the energy officially. So that's still something we're looking into, but basically we're saying 50% from all vessels, voyages coming from to EU will be taken into account in the future. You can also change the reward factor for wind, and that's stated over here. This simple handy table should help with that. And you can input the amount of shore power, electricity or energy in megajoules here as well. So you simply build up your entire fleet up to 10 vessels. If you don't need them, you should be able to delete them as well, but we're now going to go for 10 different ships to show you everything and how it is calculated. And that is done in output. So in output we see the current scenario, that's the one you are working here, and with 3 scenarios. You can change the scenario name if you like here as well. And the FuelEU penalties, I'm going to zoom in a bit, that's easier. EU ETS and total fuel costs are then taken from here, the current table, and also the name, scenario 1 table, scenario 2 table, and scenario 3 table. So what we did is we made it a bit easier. You can simply press copy and then paste in order to get the correct numbers here in your table. So this table is automatically linked to the different cases. So if we remove that, then here it is also deleted. So what happens here and what can you input? We can change the main fuel. So basically what we do in calculations, and I'll show it, we take the energy consumption first and then change it into the amount of fuel you should have if you have the previous amount of energy. So if we change MDO to, for instance, HFO, you see that we need a little bit more mass in order to get the same amount of energy ultimately. So we compare energy and not necessarily metric tons of fuel. This should come in handy. In particular, when you're working, for example, with methanol, you see that you need a lot more mass for, in that case, instead of our regular MDO that we have here as a standard. You can pick and choose a second fuel, for instance, HVO for blending, and then if we state 50% here, you see, okay, we take half of the fuel consumption or half of the energy consumption from this first fuel, and then the second fuel will be 50%. And then you see also we take into account the energy and LCV values and mass, etc. So the balance is automatic. Everything here is basically calculated in the calculations tab that I'll show you later. And if we have a positive balance, which in this case we do, 6292, we can add it and distribute it here. So now we have a positive balance, so you can maybe add 498 here, 442 here. Officially, according to the regulations, you cannot add more. Well, we don't have a maximum in the Excel, so you need to be smart a little as well. 387, and here you see you can play around and see what happens if you make different scenarios, how much you still have left, etc, etc. The calculations, as stated, are done here in calculations. This is the right hand side. I'm going to go to the left. We have all the calculations needed to determine fuel in the EU, might be changed in the future as stated. Then we have the total energy used on board, including shore power, and there we make the distinction between EU and outside EU. That's still something we're developing. Then we have the greenhouse gas intensity calculations, well to tank, tank to wake, and the totals. So you see that simply an addition according to the regulations, and those calculations are referred to here. I'll expand that shortly. Finally, we have the balance calculations. This is highlighted in yellow because we round everything to metric tons to make it easier in the output table. If you want, you can simply remove that formula, all the if statements, and simply take this value, and that will calculate everything in grams, which for some might be better. Here we have compliance added. That is taken from output, that we have everything in a nice neat cell. So here you see that we add compliance, and then we end up with a compliance after pooling in order to truly get a good estimate on the total pool balance with your input parameters. Based on these parameters, we calculate cost for FuelEU, which is simply the FuelEU formula, EU ETS, which is the EU ETS price that we've inputted at input, multiplied with the fuel consumption and the emission factors, and that I'll show later because that might change in the future as well. And also the reporting year 2025 yields only 70% of allowances, so we compensate for that here as well. And then finally the fuel cost, that's simply fuel consumption multiplied with the fuel price. Here we see that most of these values use a VLOOKUP table from the fuel table, so I'll show that after this calculations tab. And here you see that we look up the fuel here taken from the output tab and then calculate everything accordingly. So this is all, let's see, yeah, all a VLOOKUP pricing there as well. This is the output, and then we have a blend type, and the same applies here to the blend intra-EU fuel type. So what we basically do here is not much. We look up everything in fuel tables. Let's go there. So this is a pretty important tab as well, pretty important table, because we have all the fuels listed with the pricing that you can change here, fuel class, LCV values that we used, and also especially in terms of biofuels the E value, which has an effect on the well to tank value. So the regulation itself states, you can have a look at Annex 1 and or 2, I don't know it from the top of my head, but there it states that the total biofuel emission footprint, E, that's well to wake according to Renewable Energy Directive, needs to be inputted here, and what is reducted from it is the CO2 emission factor multiplied with the LCV values that you see here. Let's see, so the CF and LCV values. It's all quite complicated, but what it boils down to is that if you have your own biofuel batch, you can input the E value here, and we have simply used all the different fuel pathways from the Renewable Energy Directive. We've taken usually a quite conservative approach. We know, for example, that for most of these biofuels, or most of the members and users that we have show us and have shown us, and also in discussions with suppliers, we have seen that this value that we use is commonly closer to like 10 or 12. So what we use here is quite high and will severely impact your calculations if you are not very observant. Please note there are very many comments to make, especially with regards to RFNBO. We made some assumptions to make it more physically representable of what we thought was closer to the truth than what actually is stated in the regulations. So if you have any questions or would like to get some more help interpreting this data, feel free to contact the help desk. One more thing to mention is that the EU ETS factor, what we now do is we also take a conservative factor, which is incorporating, which will happen in the future but not until 2028, all the emission factors from CO2, CH4 and N2O. So you can also change the EU ETS emission factor here, because in the first few years your fuel, your EU ETS penalty or allowances to be paid will be less. Lots of things to say, but in terms of the tool itself, this is, as you can see, mostly simply a table. Fuel prices are input and these E values are input, and the rest are simply either calculated or stated in the regulations. So moving on to penalty tables. It's amazing to see how much information you can cramp into a single tab. But, well, the basics are easy. It's a lot of information, but that's mostly because we have 10 different ships. Here we see ship 1 until ship 10, and the total, which is a sum of all the different ships, and then a total for also every ship until 2050. And what happens here is that, well, if there's an error, we take 0, because sometimes if you delete stuff, everything gets errorized. But here we take all the totals from each ship, and if you go to the right, here we have the penalty tables for each ship individually. So greenhouse gas intensity of that ship, greenhouse gas target of that specific year, amount of energy inside EU, outside EU, resulting compliance balance. If we have added any compliance, the compliance added will be added here. After pooling, penalty resulting, EU ETS, and the fuel costs, etc. So EU ETS and fuel costs for the most part are fixed in this particular case, and then the FuelEU penalty will change accordingly. Please note that we have not included a FuelEU penalty multiplier. Each year that you have a consecutive penalty, the penalty itself will be multiplied with 10%, or not, well, that would be nice, multiplied with 110%, so by 1.1, so we'll increase even more than what you see here. We haven't done so at the moment. These penalty tables can be used if you really want to look ahead or compare the totals, sort of the life cycle analysis costs for different ships or for different cases. If you have a single ship or 10 ships, I mean one ship with 10 different fuels that you want to compare, then you can do that here as well. That leaves one more thing to mention, which is the references. The references is the place where you can see where we got our information from, and we've taken it all and put it into a neatly packed guide. The FuelEU guide, let me show you for a moment. The FuelEU guide is our way of condensing all the information into a single PDF. Condensing might not be the right word, considering it's 55 pages of information, almost more than regulation itself. But here, note that we really try to get out the most important information for you. There's also a masterclass that takes more than an hour, in which we explain to you everything that we know. And especially interesting for those of you who are doing their own analysis and calculations is, of course, how everything is calculated with respect to the different steps in the regulation, how we interpret specific data, such as, let's go over here, no, not reward factors. Oh man, this really is something. RFMU, yeah, the greenhouse gas potential values, well to tank, and LCV values. We've added all the most important notes, how we calculate it for biofuels, and as you just now saw, how it is incorporated into the Excel in general. So this is something that's continuously updating, because when we get more information or learn new things, or also when the regulation itself is updated, we also update this table to make sure that it represents the latest that we know. And basically that's it in terms of the tool. One more thing to mention, again, our goal is to make your life easier. Easier said than done as well, but honestly, just contact the help desk if you are in need of any clarifications at all. It's complicated enough as it is, and you don't have to do everything on your own. That being said, calculating from time to time on your own can also be fun, so enjoy the Excel sheet, enjoy FuelEU pooling, and have a great day.